Hello, my friends. I'm back again. This is Deepak Chopra, and we're continuing our series on conversations with scientists and philosophers. We've called these conversations on the cutting edge of science, and we've called it spirituality. If by that we mean self awareness, nothing religious, but a means of contemplative inquiry. And so we've had Dr. Frank Wilczek before in the series, but last time it was with Leonard Bellardno and another physicist, Diane Keating, not Diane Keating, Brian Keating. And the conversation kind of got unfocused a little bit. It was fascinating. We veered into some metaphysical discuss, but we might do that again. But today I want to talk specifically about the book, Fundamentals 10 Keys to Reality. The author is Dr. Frank Wilczek, Nobel Laureate in Physics, a professor at MIT, and one of the luminaries in modern cosmology. He's a Nobel Laureate and he discovered a particle, and he's known for asymptotic freedom and many, many other things. A real honor to have you again, sir.
Well, it's wonderful to be here and
So, first of all,
talk about big
yes,
issues.
big issues. I've been rereading the book. Last time I had a PDF, so it was not that easy, but now I've been rereading your book. And I think because our audience, my audience here, which we reach up to 15 million people, but they're not scientists. They read things like this. Okay.
Oh
The new,
yes, well that's
okay, so they're basically readers of literature that comes from reliable sources like Scientific American and the New Scientist, but
yes,
they're not scientists.
those are
Okay.
the kinds of people those are some of my best friends are people like that, and really this book was written largely in response to conversations with that kind of friend and what I
That's
thought
why
they were reaching for.
Yeah, so that's why I wanted to really now today focus on the book. And all my friends, you must buy this book. Check it out. It just got released and it's now out in the bookstores. And, if you're even a dabbler in science, want to understand some of the big issues, this is the book for you. I'll read the chapter headings later, but today, without going into metaphysical speculation, I want to address the basic topics in this book. And towards the end, maybe we can shoot the breeze about
Right, what it all means.
Okay. So, Dr. Wilczek, you wrote this book for a specific reason. You just said it's the kind of people who want to understand science, but have a deep longing to understand the nature of reality. And yet, most of us who are not professional scientists, I'm a physician, I'm a endocrinologist
Yeah.
by training, but I'm not a professional scientist, a basic scientist like you are. So I think for our audience, we should just begin with the very basics in this book. And the first thing is, what do we know about the physical world? What is the physical world?
Okay. Well, one objective measure of our knowledge of the physical world is how well we can control it to build interesting objects that serve our purposes. So for that, we've, over the course of several centuries in fundamental science, built up a deep understanding of how matter, that is the stuff that we believe is the subject matter of biology and chemistry and all forms of engineering, of how it works, what it is and how it works. We've built up over time a description whose accuracy, completeness, and power it would be difficult to overstate. Now, so for purposes of everyday life, we've gotten profound understanding of matter that allows us, for instance, to build computers, to build the kinds of means of communication we're enjoying right now, and to build the GPS system, and so it goes on and on. So there's a very practical sort of show me aspect to reality that can be embodied, and that is partly the outcome, that theoretical and practical understanding is partly driven or by exactly economic and sort of social goals to make useful things, but it's also driven by just curiosity or a kind of spirituality. I'm willing to go there because that really was the path that I myself largely followed. If you want, to me, and I think to many of the great practitioners of science in the past, what they thought they were about, and frequently articulated actually, was that one road to understanding what God is to understand God's work, to understand the and uh, and when you study the physical world and try to drill down to the basics of how it works, it's not disappointing. It's full of surprises, full of really amazingly elegant principles that you can state very concisely in mathematics, but also conceptually, and unfolding those principles, which could be stated in a very fully in a short computer program, and with more work in a lot of words, like in fundamentals. Those principles, when you unfold them, give you that powerful control of nature that I mentioned, and also a kind of mind expansion, because you see a way of understanding the world that's very specific, very rich, and complementary to the way we organize everyday experience.
My
So,
dear friends, I'm talking to Dr. Frank Wilczek, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, the author of Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality. And we're talking about his book right now. And right in the beginning, in the preface, let me quote what Dr. Wilczek says. In studying how the world works, we are studying how God works. Now, of course, people have different ideas about what God is, but never
yeah.
mind. But he says we are studying how God works and thereby learning what God is. In that spirit, we can interpret the search for knowledge as a form of worship and our discoveries as revelations. I think that's very poetically stated, but indeed,
But
I think every scientific
I
discovery,
mean it.
every
Yeah,
scientific
yeah,
discovery is a revelation. And in this book,
absolutely.
Wilczek actually goes over the history of science, also the scientific revolution, which began about 500 years ago. He goes through the work of Newton. He goes through the work of many eminent scientists in that area. He also quotes philosophers like Descartes and others. But the most important thing, and Wittgenstein, but the most important thing for us here, lay people, is to begin to get some comprehension about the workings of nature, possibly even the mechanics of what we call the creation of the universe. So, to elaborate on what,
May I just add one thing?
yes,
May I just, so you mentioned an enormous number of things that indeed are touched on in the book. But you might notice that if you looked, that it's not a very thick book, or I don't want it to seem intimidating,
no, no,
because
it's not. It's
do
consequent.
the work of I've tried to do the work of really distilling the essence of the history of science, and the big ideas that emerge and the sort of the conceptual structures that emerge. And so this is not physics 101. It's it's or a work of history. It's really an overview meant to give you a global perspective.
Correct. Well,
of course, you can go deeper, but
I've
not.
read Physics 101. I've read a lot of books, good science. But this is very concentrated and it's very illuminating because it makes us think and even question some of the things that you talk about, as well as, what are the limitations of knowing and all that. But let me go back to the book. So going back to what we know about the physical world, what is the physical world made of and how does it work? I mean, this is, you address this very clearly. What is it made of? What is the world?
Well, let me put that in a broader frame, which is to give the spirit of the thing. Because if we started to go into the technical details, we could get pretty deep pretty quickly, and maybe lose sight of the main message. But we can get deeper. But let me start with kind of the framing, which I think the best way to frame it maybe is Democritus. He made us. We only have fragments from Democritus, but one of the most striking fragments is he said, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but in appearance, there's hot and cold and different kinds of colors, different kinds of tastes. But in reality, it's just atoms in the void. So the concept, the big concept there is that our ultimate description of matter can be in quite different terms from the description that helps us get around in everyday life, and that's useful in interacting with the world here on Earth under ordinary conditions on sort of human scales. What we learn when we use all the instruments of modern science and critical thinking and logic is that, first of all, there's enormous, the bodies we think of as our own bodies or the bodies we find around us are actually made out of many, many, many smaller units that whose individual properties, if we drill down far enough, become very, very simple, but build up to complexity. And the properties of matter that are at the bottom of it in our current description of the world are a very small number of kinds of properties that indeed are not hot or cold or colors or the things we normally think of as our sensory experience, but mass, charge, and spin. That's all. The elementary particles have mass, charge, and spin, and they don't have sizes, they don't have shapes. They can be thought of as just places in space-time where charge, spin, and mass are concentrated. And there are only a few kinds of concentrations that we call elementary particles that are the ones that are actually occur in nature. So, and they occur in vast numbers. So they're like a very exotic kind of Lego brick. And we know how they interact quite fully. We've done many experiments over the centuries, and especially in 20th century physics with powerful instruments. And we understand their behavior very deeply. And it's since their behavior has been measured very accurately under all kinds of extreme conditions, we can be pretty confident that we understand the laws well enough to do biology, chemistry, all forms of engineering on a firm foundation. And so they're for purposes of practical world, the practical world of biology, engineering, chemistry, the only important particles are electrons and photons, and two kinds of quarks and gluons, and that's it. And so those are very particular properties. They satisfy very special mathematical equations that if you go to graduate school for a while, you can understand, and they're very, very beautiful. They're not disappointing if you can spare the time and effort to learn about it. But you don't have to. You can just take my word for it. This description is very elegant. You don't have to take my word for it, though, that it works, because that evidence for that is all around you. And so that's kind of where rock bottom is now. We understand, we have analyzed the behavior of matter into these very small bits. And then there's the dual task of synthesis, where you have, okay, so you understand the basic behavior and it's very abstract and it doesn't contain taste and color, hot and cold, but the world does. So you have this great challenge of building the world back up from this description, which there's very good reason to think is complete and precise, but very far removed from everyday experience. And how do you build the world? Where am I in those equations? To me, that's a wonderful challenge that we find ourselves with at this moment.
I'm speaking to Dr. Frank Wilczek, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. His book is called Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality. And so far, what we've learned is from Dr. Wilczek and in the book is that the most fundamental modern ingredients of matter are things called spin, charge, and mass that somehow uh, reshuffle
Yes.
natural laws to produce everything that we call reality. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And then,
Yes. And the substance, the deepest substance, we talk about elementary particles, but elementary particles are really not the primary ingredient out of which we construct reality in our best modern understanding. It's something called quantum fields, and quantum fields are space-filling structures that support activity. So they're in constant fluctuations. This is quantum fluctuations that are everywhere. And so what we see as empty space is not really empty at all to a physicist. It's full of stuff going on. And what we call the elementary particles are really stable excitations on top of this medium. So it's like you have if you had a body of water, for instance, is the simplest thing, the most familiar thing. You have a body of water, and so that's like the quantum fields. And if you shake it and waves go out, those are like the particles. The particles are excitations in these fields, and these excitations can be very, very stable in this context, and that's what we're made out of, is the excitations in these fields.
so in this book, you start explaining how these very fundamental properties of existence, if I may call it existence, or reality, are mass, spin, and charge. And then they give rise to elementary particles, photons, gluons, neutrons, protons, electromagnetic activity, strong and weak interactions, which ultimately give rise to the physical universe. And of course, you also say that gravity doesn't fit this whole scheme at the moment.
Well, it doesn't fit neatly. I mean, for practical purposes, we can hide the difficulties very, very well. So, for instance, in astrophysics, people study the properties of stars and galaxies and so forth. And of course, the stars and galaxies are made out of the matter we've been talking about that that obeys the principles of quantum theory, and astrophysicists every day work very successfully with these laws where gravity lives in sort of peaceful coexistence with the other interactions. And we even have some indications of how they might ultimately be unified within the common description. The other three forces, I should say, the strong, weak, and electromagnetic forces, are mathematically at a deep level very, very similar. And so we have very concrete ideas about how they fit together. Not entirely experimentally verified, but compelling logically, and certainly they work together very smoothly. So we would like to have a more intellectually satisfying, aesthetically pleasing description of all the forces that puts them on the same footing and makes their connection or common origin clear. At present, we're not quite there, but it's not a crisis, so to speak. It's just an aesthetic problem. There's no contradiction with experiment that people have been able to identify in so far. Yeah.
You do mention in the book that now we have the ability to measure gravitational waves, right?
Yes.
In the book. So
Yes.
so
Yes.
you positing a particle, a graviton, something like
Yes. Well, the gravitational interaction, although it dominates the cosmos, is actually, in the fundamental description, a very, very, very weak force. When you look at the effect of the gravitational interaction or force between, say, two electrons, it's ridiculously small compared to the electromagnetic force. If you take the ratio of the electromagnetic force to the gravitational force, it would be 1 followed by 40 zeros or so. So not 10, not 100, not 1,000. Keep going, keep going, keep going. It's incredibly large ratio. Gravity is very, very weak on elementary particle scales, but it builds up, whereas electromagnetism cancels between positive and negative charges. Gravity just keeps building up because it's always attractive as far as the great, so gravity, despite appearances, is actually a very weak force fundamentally. And another manifestation of that is that whereas electromagnetic waves, the disturbances in electromagnetic fields that are made of photons, are the basis of many technologies. Well, our communication technologies, our computer lighting displays, and so forth, are all light as photons, and microwave ovens, and so many, many other things. Electromagnetic waves we can control very well, and we also see many circumstances in which those waves can be detected as individual particles. So maybe the most extreme version of that, which might be familiar, but is still reasonably familiar maybe to some of your audience members, is if you've ever played with a Geiger counter or seen one in a movie, the Geiger counters detect radioactivity, and you hear them click, click, click. Each of those is the arrival of one photon so these electromagnetic waves, when their frequency is very high, the individual photons have a lot of energy and can be detected individually. Okay, so this is a very long-winded way of saying that in the case of gravitational waves, there's no such technology. And that's because the gravitational interaction is fundamentally so much weaker. The actual gravitational waves that were detected only with an extraordinarily heroic engineering endeavor that used many resources of modern technology with lasers and control of vibrations and very delicate tricks of manipulating light and quanta And what this LIGO detector succeeded in measuring was displacements between two mirrors that are about 4 kilometers apart. That you had these little displacements as the gravitational wave was passing that are 1/1000th of the size of an atomic nucleus. So an extraordinarily small effect. And that effect is caused by the collective action of many, many gravitons. So the initiating event was the merger of two black holes, gigantic black holes far away, which causes big disturbances in the gravitational field, and those disturbances propagate as waves to us, and we detect these, and then they're detected as these tiny, tiny ripples in space-time. Now that's caused by the collective action, as I said, of many, many gravitons, in theory. But if you want to detect the action of one graviton and to really see that this wave is made out of atoms, so to speak, of gravity, you would need to do much more sensitive or even more sensitive experiments, or different kinds of experiments, in order to see that you don't have a continuous wave, but actually the effect of individual gravitons, to be able to resolve one at a time. That's a great challenge at the frontiers of physics, and I'm working on it. I'm actually working on that one. I think I certainly can't declare victory at this time, but whereas a few months ago I would have said it was utterly hopeless, now I see some hope.
Well, that's very good to know.
Because in the final stages, when the black holes start to merge, so they're just barely turning, the most violent endpoint of the whole thing, there are effects that distinguish the classical behavior, which has been assumed so far, which doesn't take into account that there are gravitons, to the physical reality of the gravitational field, in which quantum mechanics is really important. So I'm sure that there is a big distinction, but its experimental consequences, and whether you can really do experiments that demonstrate it convincingly, is a work in progress.
Well, first of all, congratulations that you're close to possibly fulfilling this dream that Einstein had, of grand unification, the grand unification of all the forces in the universe. So let's assume, for example, and I guess everybody assumes that the LIGO experiment was good enough to convince everyone that there are gravitational waves.
Well, it's been given the seal of approval by the Swedish Academy. So it'd be very embarrassing.
That means we're very much closer than before, or closer to the grand unification theory. So how is this knowledge helpful to both scientists, the future of technology, but for me, or a regular guy on the street, who doesn't think about these things every day? These theories, the practical implications of these theories, the technologies that emerge from this, they affect our lives. Last 500 years has seen human civilization progress as it has never progressed since the Big Bang. So
yes, you can quantify that human productivity was relatively flat for many, many centuries, and then with the scientific revolution, it really took off.
Yeah.
So there's one and only one graph in my, or one and only diagram in my book, which is exactly this plot of the growth of human productivity. And you see, it's basically like a hockey stick. It's level for centuries and centuries, and then suddenly in the 18th century starts to take off, and is exponentially growing with no end in sight. Yeah.
And it's changing the way we live our lives, changing the future.
Oh, absolutely.
Of our evolution on this planet. It's changing everything.
Oh, it's changing everything. It allows us to communicate as we're doing now. It also is giving us new kinds of friends. I call them our silicon friends, the computers that enrich our lives in many ways. Makes so much of human knowledge easily accessible. You don't have to haul yourself over to a library and go through dusty books. You can click and you have access to it, even beyond what the greatest libraries in the world have in terms of at least the latest and greatest information. And for a scientist, certainly for me, being able to have such a willing slave and collaborator that does calculations and gives me feedback really has made the work more fun and more productive, for sure.
And has
And
given people like me the privilege to directly speak to a Nobel laureate and a luminary like you through just this technology. So that's, of course, the gift of science, and many more. I think we can say that the limitations are that are no limitations, which brings me to a question that I had when I was reading the book. Are there questions that fundamental science cannot address?
oh yes, there are many questions that fundamental science cannot address. And I think
Yes.
it's very important that people realize that and very important that scientists realize that too. Uh, and I would say that there are two distinct categories there of questions that science can't really plausibly hope to address. So one is questions of what ought to be, how we ought to behave, what are the goals of human life, because we can say a lot about how things work and what they are, and of course that can tell us important things about the consequences of choices that we make, but it doesn't tell us really, and can't, I don't think, what choices we should make. What does it? It's a different kind of question. I agree with David Hume, the great philosopher, who really emphasized this, that there's a logical gap between statements about is and statements about ought that just cannot be bridged, no matter how much you say about is and how valid it is. It doesn't tell you about ought. That's a different domain of discourse. And so that's one limitation. The other limitation is kind of emerges from science itself. We learn about, I won't take the joy of the book out of potential readers' hands too much by going into great detail here or elsewhere, but in this discussion. But there are limitations like that arise from the fact that there are so many fundamental fundamental units, building blocks in any of the macroscopic objects we deal with, or there's so many copies in the universe that you can't really solve the equations when there are that many things to deal with. Even if you could, there are big limitations due to the quantum uncertainty principle and to the phenomenon of chaos, which tells us that if you make tiny mistakes in your entry of data, so to speak, that they amplify over time. So so the no knowledge of the basic principles of how the world works will tell us about the details of life on Earth from first principles. You just have to go out and look. No, they will never tell us what the history of England was or is going to be, because there's just too complicated. Even if you could, in principle, figure it out, in practice you can't, and I think even in principle you can't. So fundamental understanding kind of discovers some of its own limitations, and philosophy discovers others. Yeah.
And you mentioned these in the book. As I said,
Yeah.
we don't want to give away the book altogether. You mentioned these in the book, and also the fact that there are fundamental limitations of just doing science itself. There are certain fundamental limitations in the methodologies of science, and which then brings up big questions that we can address at some other point. Can we get beyond Planck scale? Do we know what caused the Big Bang? Why does the
Oh,
cosmological constant not fit in
oh,
the general scheme? But those
yeah.
are other.
Well, there are certainly loose ends and puzzle. Well, loose ends doesn't do it justice. There are open questions at the frontiers of science that I think we should and do aspire to address with the methods of science, but so far have not
Yes.
been successfully conquered. It's a moving frontier,
And
but
yet,
there definitely is a frontier beyond which we presently haven't civilized or haven't civilized the world, the physical world, right?
and yet, going through what you said in the book and going through what we do know, the
Mm.
implications are huge. The speculations are also amazing. There may be life on other planets. There may be exoplanets with the same biosphere that we have. It may be
Oh
possible to
yes,
communicate with these entities at some point through
yeah,
teleportation or quantum entanglement or whatever. The implications are huge at the moment, right? Even with
yes.
what we.
Arthur C. Clarke had a third law, which
Mhm.
said that any sufficiently advanced technology uh, looks like magic. And certainly, if you imagine going back 100 years, and or let's do it the other way. Let's imagine we could take Albert Einstein from 1920 to 2020, or 1921 to 2021. He would be astonished, even though he had a brilliant understanding of physical law as it existed then. He wouldn't be able to understand. He wouldn't immediately, without a few weeks at least of study to catch up, he would have no idea how the instruments I have in my lap or all around us work. Right? They would seem like magic. He would be sure that it wasn't magic, but probably, but he would be confident that it wasn't magic, but he wouldn't really know how it works. And 100 years from now, I have no doubt that technology, we can sort of see that technology is developing so rapidly, and our control of matter is so impressive that we can sense, engineers and scientists can sense that there are directions in which we can push that will go very far in the foreseeable future. So we may have quantum computers, we may have much more accurate ways of measuring time and space. We may, we'll bet, well, our silicon friends will get more human-like, more friendly, so to speak, be better comrades. And of course, there are also dangers that escalate as we acquire more power. But on the whole, I'm optimistic, and for sure, we are acquiring more power.
I'm speaking to Dr. Wilczek, Nobel Prize winner in physics. His book is Fundamentals 10 Keys to Reality. We've discussed some of the issues that he brings up, and I'll just quote a little bit from some of the pearls of wisdom that I found in the book. And that is basic laws describe change. Laws are universal, so whatever is here is everywhere else. Basic laws are local. I noticed you didn't go too much into non-locality. Basic laws are precise. They can be formulated as mathematical equations. So by looking at what is happening here, we can, in fact, reasonably speculate of what is happening everywhere else. So, Dr.
Well, as concerns the fundamental laws, yes, that's right. Our fundamental description has incorporated these hypotheses. They didn't have to be correct. It's very not trivial that they are correct, but they do seem to be correct. That so far in giving us this very powerful description of nature, that the same laws hold everywhere and for all time. That the laws are precise statements about how things change, and the laws, the rules for how things change are at any place in space and time can be formulated in terms of what's happening nearby. You don't have to keep track of the whole universe to predict things here.
Right.
That's locality.
You don't have to go there to know what's happening there, but you can know what's happening there by knowing what's happening.
Yes, there's no mechanism in physical law for astrology to work, for instance. We don't know how that would happen.
Other than our biological rhythms, circadian rhythms and seasonal rhythms and gravitational rhythms, they do affect our body biology.
Oh yes, oh yes, yes. So there might be a logic. How should I say? There might be correlations
That's right.
that arise, but at the level of so the fundamental laws as they unfold and their consequences in the world, as in the way they're embodied, of course you can have correlations between distant objects. I mean, you know, if I have a pair of shoes and I separate them, there's still be one left shoe and one right shoe. It does. There can be correlations, but in terms of the behavior, the immediate behavior, it can always be in our fundamental description. It seems that it can always be traced to local interactions.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, but I'm also not a fan of astrology in the way you kind of indicated. On the other hand, I know that my biological rhythms, my circadian rhythms,
Oh yeah,
rhythms, my gravitational rhythms affect my mood and my mood.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. So definitely, we carry within us many kinds of internal clocks, if you like. So we have rhythms, and of course there are also external clocks. There are clocks. The moon goes around regularly, and we go around the sun. We go around the sun regularly, and so forth. And certainly those clocks. It's a very profound fact, also, which, although we tend to take it for granted, is a profound fact about the world. That all these clocks are synchronized, right? And I actually that's something I emphasize in the book, how miraculous that is and how profound that is. So that's
very interesting. That's a very
there are lots of strange discussions of what time is, and okay, depending on if you use a fuzzy definition of time, of course, you're never going to come to a precise understanding. But if you start from the phenomena that all these rhythms, so the rhythms of our bodies, the rhythms of the planets, the rhythms that a clock on my wrist beats to, all these rhythms are synchronized. They all happen to work together. So this is a profound fact. And to me, that's what time is. For a physicist, time, all those things can be captured in equations where there's a variable called t, and lots of other things are functions of t, but there's only one t, and it applies to everybody. Right?
By the way, that's such an interesting insight that I have many more questions just on an insight, because we experience time biologically, psychologically.
Yes.
My time is different when I'm at the dentist, and when I'm
yes.
different when I fall in love, and it stops when I transcend, all of that.
Yeah.
But
yes.
One insight that you just shared, and excuse me, as a layperson, I'm going to ask you this at the expense of being ridiculed, but if all the clocks and all the time loops are synchronized, is that non-local, that synchronization of all the clocks in the universe? How does it happen?
You know, I don't, I can't describe it any more deeply than that. I mean, when I speak of the locality of physical laws and in this discussion, I'm assuming that there's such a thing as space-time, and that seems to be that's kind of fundamental built into our description. Maybe we'll be able to get beyond that someday, but at present, that's the description, and it's hard to say that it's non-local because it's kind of the definition of locality is that difference to points in space and time.
But these synchronized.
That the behavior here can be understood in terms of things that are going on very nearby. But yes, I mean, I think you're onto something in a sense that it's a miracle that you kind of strains the use of the word locality, that that time works the same everywhere. Right?
So, my dear friends, and we are hoping to reach in the next few weeks about 15 million people with this conversation. Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality by Frank Wilczek, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel Prize in Physics. And there's a lot of rich material here, right in the beginning, in the preface and the introduction. You will hear why there is abundance of everything out there in the cosmos, but also in here, in us. Complementarity
Yes.
of abundance, unlimited abundance out there in here. Dr. Wilczek
Well,
also.
I like to say that the world is very large, but that doesn't mean that we're small. We're large too.
And you quote, great people like, what's his name, Walt Whitman, when he says we contain multitudes. You quote, I think, William Blake, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see the world as it really is, infinite. And then you also talk a lot about complementarity. We didn't get into that, but, kind of other people that I talk to are on to now complementarity also, whether it's complementarity of space-time, wave particle, mass energy, body-mind, biological organism and world appearance, consciousness and subconscious, science and philosophy. And you talk about humility and self-respect.
Humility and self-respect. I'm surprised you didn't mention free will and determinism.
No, you talk about that, and last time we discussed, there are also complementarities. So there's a lot of rich material in this book. Please pick it up and try and, speculate yourself, engage in contemplative inquiry yourself with the statements in this book, because Dr. Wilczek not only is talking science here, but he says this is a contemplation. For him, this was a contemplation. So
one of my friends that I mentioned before that I wrote this book for told me that she thought of this book as kind of a modern book of hours. If you know what a book of hours is,
yes.
It's kind of a book that people look at, a little tiny book they carry around with themselves and contemplate passages on a regular basis. And,
well, I've been doing
she said it, but I think it's not inappropriate, right?
By the way, I've been doing that. I've been using it that way, and I see all the ways. I've underlined the book and made notes and squiggles and all of that. So it is.
I'm really touched and I'm really impressed. Thank you.
No. I mean, every page I've been studying, and it has given me many insights. So if you're amenable, there are lots of topics here. We can do that periodically, address some of the topics in the book.
I'd be happy to if you have the patience for it.
Today we didn't even begin. But before I let you go, I want to share something with you, and I want your opinion on this, okay? So, notwithstanding my history with some scientists and militant atheists and all of that in the past, and also, accusations leveled at me about pseudoscience and all that, but that notwithstanding that, I have had communication with some very interesting thinkers in our field. And one of them used to be Freeman Dyson. And
Oh, yeah, he was a good friend of mine, as you might know. Yeah.
sure, but I was privileged once to receive an email from him. And I asked Freeman, what are the most important things that have kept you awake at night? Okay. And he responded. I have his email, and
Uh,
I have kept it for posterity.
oh, I'd be so interested to hear that if you're willing to share. Yeah.
So he said three riddles have
Freeman, by the way, just before you start, let me mention that uh, I was a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study for about 10 years, actually. And Freeman had the office directly above me. So I would often hear him laugh, and and we became quite good friends. Yeah.
unlike you, he wasn't a Nobel laureate, though.
Well, he easily could have been and probably should have been, because his work on cleaning up quantum electrodynamics and really constructing the modern theory of quantum fields was absolutely fundamental and very fruitful.
Yes, everyone says that. So here's the email. He said, I said, what keeps you up at night? And he said, three riddles have occupied me all my life. Three
Uh-huh.
riddles. The first is the unpredictable movement of atoms. Now, it was very interesting that he didn't say random. He said unpredictable movement of atoms. To me, that was a fine distinction.
Yes, that's very good. Yeah.
The second riddle, a universe fine-tuned for mind and life.
Uh-huh.
And
Yes.
three, our own consciousness. So those are the three riddles. And then he ends by saying, I do not know the answers to these riddles, but I have a feeling they're somehow connected.
Uh-huh. That's very, very well, that's Freeman. He's one of the smartest, maybe the smartest person I've ever known. And also a very sweet person. And yeah, that's a pretty good choice of three riddles, I would say. So, and
Occupying
I
Freeman
what's
Dyson
that?
for his life. I
Excuse
said
me?
three riddles that occupied his mind during his lifetime, he said. That's what he
That
said.
kept him awake. Yeah. Right. I think the question of understanding the molecular basis of mind as it's realized in the human brain, I think that's a great problem on which we can hope to make progress uh, very realistically in the next in coming years. Uh, the whether I mean the unpredictable nature of atoms, I guess I don't. I've learned to live with that and enjoy it. That the principles of quantum mechanics, although they do lead to this kind of uh, limited unpredictability in certain respects, uh, the unpredictability is really based in our partial knowledge of the underlying conditions. Anyway, that's a discussion in itself. But I think quantum mechanics, to me,
Yeah.
is not it doesn't keep me up at night,
Yeah.
except when I'm working on it and playing with it. And the third one was the fine tuning. And yeah, that's it is true that well, this is another aspect, I guess, of this great question of, okay, those are the equations. Why am I there? Why am I here? Right? We have these equations. We have a description of the history of the universe in broad terms. How do I see myself in those equations? Where is consciousness? Where is mind? And why are the equations such as to yield the possibility of mind emerging? They seem to need some special properties in our current understanding, and the emergence of mind is such a fundamental aspect of our experience that it's disturbing that it seems to be kind of a touch and go thing in the fundamental equations. You could change them in ways that seem perfectly possible logically, and then wind up with a catastrophic result. No minds to contemplate these equations. Yeah, it keeps me up at night too.
Well, right now, in the field of biology, which is something that I'm more familiar with in biology, we can describe the entire body in terms of mathematical equations, all the biochemistry, all the feedback
Yeah.
loop, all of that can be described. But it still is a kind of a mystery what gives wings to those equations, what makes those
Yes.
equations, make the universe move. What is the alchemy of spin, charge, and mass, and what is driving that?
Yeah.
We
How do
also
you get from there to in our inner experience?
That's it.
Uh, no, we've gotten a lot better understanding of how the brain works, but it's still fairly primitive in many ways. And we've also gathered experience now in making kinds of artificial minds, computers that can do very impressive things. But it hasn't really come together yet, and at least for me, in a clear way that I can look at the equations and say, oh yes, I can see a path from these equations to the world as I experience my inner world. And
So my last
a
question.
great challenge, and a great challenge to imagination.
Thank you. My last question, because if we run over 1 hour, then we have limitation on many networks. We can carry this conversation again, future, if you're amenable to it. But my last question is, are you sympathetic as a person who's interested in complementarity? Are you sympathetic to the notion that mind and matter may be complementary activities at a very fundamental level, at that level that you're speaking of, charge,
Right.
mass, and spin, at that level, something even deeper that is
I am,
differentiating into my matter?
and I've even tried to explore somewhat in that direction. And I think this is a theme that's emerging now in the frontiers of physics, that instead there might be a complementary description to the description that's now so successful in terms of a space-time continuum and mass, charge, and
Physical laws, yeah.
and spin. There may be a different way of describing it, or that may be even more inclusive, or talk about or be able to address different kinds of questions that would be based on concepts like information, organized in different ways. So, but however, having said that, I'm sympathetic to it. That to the quest, it has not so far yielded results that are as tangible and as impressive as this more reductive analysis and synthesis process has achieved. But it's a very interesting direction, and there are, I would say, tantalizing clues that to get to a deeper description of nature, there are phenomena that we should really think about in terms of flows of information as opposed to flows of mass, charge, and spin.
Wonderful. My very special guest has been Dr. Frank Wilczek, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. The book is Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality. Check it out the way I've been checking it out. And send us questions. If you have questions for Dr. Wilczek, myself,
that would be great. Yeah.
That would be a good way to further this discussion if we get questions from both scientists and non-scientists.
Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed this very much, and sure, to be continued if you would like.
Thank you, Dr. Wilczek.